Hello and welcome to GCSE Sociology, Crime and Deviance, Paper 2. Before you get going on this presentation, you might want to think about how you're going to revise and what equipment you'll need. Any of the following from plain paper to note paper, coloured pens, rulers, easy guides, revision guides, any of your class and homework materials could be useful here. I would suggest that you can either split up your page into a spider diagram, and from there you might want to divide that into, say, functionalist, Marxist, feminist, interactionist views. You may want to pick different headings of your own choosing, or those from the slide, just to help you remember what each key topic, each key part of this section is. You may want to divide your paper into 4, and for each quarter think about types of crime, the measuring and recording of crime, theoretical perspectives, and social stratification of crime. What you can't fit in those quarters you may well see as not as useful. This may help you make more considered, more concise notes. Also, make sure you've got a cup of tea on hand, that you're nice and relaxed, and that you can take breaks and think about what it is you're writing. Pause, plan out your ideas, think of any questions you have. Think of anything that you need help with that you can come and ask for. The first thing you'll need to demonstrate to the examiners is that you know the difference between crime and deviance, and how they can be affected by time, place, culture, and social situation. What we need to start with then is the simple idea that crime is anything which is against the law. It's something that any society has decided is illegal and therefore can be punished by the law, by the criminal justice system. Deviance is a much bigger category, and deviance doesn't necessarily mean it's something that's wrong or something that's illegal. It's anything which is not normal, and that can come down to your culture. That can be, for example, dressing in the other gender's clothes. If you do that in the privacy of your own home, that may not be seen as deviant. But if you do it out in public, that can be interpreted as deviant, particularly if you subscribe to Becker's views. The social situation, for example, can make an act deviant. What you do at school compared to what you may do in the street with your friends and who's around can also determine if something's deviant. That may be such as dress. You may break a school's uniform policies, which isn't necessarily a crime, but there are punishments for that. So to recap, essentially crime is a type of deviance. It is very specific, and it is anything which breaks the law. Deviance is anything which can be deemed as not normal behaviour for you, for that situation, for that culture. And remember, these are socially constructed, and these can depend entirely on the act itself and who's doing it, where, when, why, and what that means. Understanding how crime is measured is really important for the exam. Remember, research methods are interweaved in every single part of the exam, paper 1 and paper 2. And crime has probably some of the most demonstrable, easiest ways to see research in action. So crime is measured through official statistics, which is taken by the police, used by the Home Office, used by the Office of National Statistics, and these are known as official statistics. These are also recorded crime. Recorded crime is any crime which is written down, and usually it means it's been followed up by the police, by the courts, by the justice system in some way. So crime can be measured in many different ways. Often the victims, the offenders, their race, their identity, their gender, their age, their social class, etc. are measured in some way, and this can vary massively depending on who's doing the measuring, when it's measured. Obviously in the past measurements were different. And it can be also about whether there's a study involved rather than official statistics. So sociologists may be able to find out more because they are not the criminal justice system. That's when we get into things like victim surveys, where victims report on what has happened to them in a given time period. Obviously, if that time period is a year or 5 years, that can have its flaws, because any crimes which happen to them outside of that time period won't be recorded. Self-report studies where criminals anonymously report what crimes they've committed can be really useful. Obviously, the ethical consideration of anonymity, confidentiality is there. Also, whether or not criminals are old enough, mature enough, or in the right state of mind to report accurately is something to consider. Are they going to plump their record, as it were, and admit to more crimes or exaggerate their crimes? Is something you may want to consider. The most important concept, though, is one of the dark figure of crime. The iceberg is always the obvious metaphor for this. Recorded crime sits above the water. We can all see it. We can see it reported in the media. We can Google it. We can find it measured. But the British Crime Survey obviously showed us from an early standpoint in the 80s onwards, there's much more crime which goes unreported and even unrecorded. And that may be because the police feel the crimes reported are far too petty. It may be embarrassment. Sexual crimes such as rape and sexual assault may not get reported because of shame, because of stigma. And this goes back to the social construct of crime and deviance, and how people see themselves as victims, as offenders. Obviously, there's physical criminal records as well, such as the fingerprints, the DNA records that police now keep, who's actually in prison and in and out of prison, who goes to court. Those kind of numbers can be used to help us figure out a picture of the dark figure and of real crime. When it comes to this in the exam, remember, you may well get an item or a source which shows a chart or a graph, and you want to talk about patterns and trends. You want to talk about ethical considerations. You want to talk about validity and reliability of the data. You want to talk about who is involved and what that means and what that shows us. So whether that's gender, ethnicity, class, age, these could all be things that pop up on the exam, and you want to be aware of those and apply the best fit of information to the question to ensure you get the marks. The social construction of crime is a key concept to understand. We've seen this already, and we've seen this previously, such as how crime and deviance can vary massively across cultures. What's rude or illegal in one country isn't necessarily so in another, and vice versa. So when sociologists talk about the social construction of crime, they're talking about a value consensus, what are agreed norms and values, and how criminals and deviants step outside that. You'll see things like theft and murder as almost obvious crimes, almost obvious deviants. Pretty much every society agrees those are wrong. But beyond that, and spreading out from that, the more specific behaviours and the more specific ideas about what's rude, what's deviant, what's even criminal, shows us how this is socially constructed. So crime and deviance has changed massively over time. Drugs and alcohol that used to be readily available or are no longer readily available show that crime is socially constructed. As society changes and changes its mind about these substances, they make some illegal, they make some restricted to certain age groups, they make some legal. Suicide and homosexuality are both acts which have been studied extensively by sociologists. Obviously, Durkheim did a massive study of suicide as an act of deviance and looked at how that was informed by social inequality and other factors, religion being one. And he talked about how essentially suicide can show us the health of a society, which is a very functionalist idea. We'd looked at Alan Turing before as well, and how religion and social norms and values can play a massive part in how certain people can be stigmatized and set outside of society no matter who they are, and what that can mean for the law. Social media these days has a huge impact on how people are outed, if you like, for different acts of deviance, different norms. There are different campaigns there, and the media throughout time has helped socially construct crime through things like agenda setting, the way certain crimes are overly reported and certain crimes are underreported. You may see the headlines here, such as the Wild Ones. Well, that was a famous case of the Mods and Rockers, two social groups, two teenage groups who fought in Brighton, and this caused a moral panic. This caused a massive outrage. Cohen deals with this when he talks about delinquency and ideas of masculinity as well, and of youth deviance. And you may want to ask yourself, which type of criminals do you see in the newspapers a lot? Which class of criminals? Are white-collar crimes more or less reported? What we could call blue-collar or lower-class crimes, higher rates of reporting. The language that's used around it can also influence the social construction of crime and how we deal with offenders. You know, the torture, the violent executions of the past were designed to deter and to instill fear in the population. Now we use prison and A lot of sociologists would see that as we move from punishing the body to punishing the mind, because as a society that's what we value more. We take away someone's liberty and that's enough. And if you remember how that's seen in different cultures, which we will come to, that might help you explain why certain sociologists see crime as socially constructed against values or against classes, whether they're functionalist or whether they're Marxist. Factors affecting criminal behaviour. One thing that sociologists, psychologists, criminologists, all of these different people that may be involved in studying crime try to do is explain it. What causes it? What makes someone commit a crime? The earliest studies tend to point towards biological explanations. You may recognise Cesare Lombroso, the Italian criminologist, from the picture in the top right, and behind him you can see different skulls. He is the go-to example for biological explanations. If this comes up in the exam, Lombroso's work seems fairly laughable to us in modern times. He was measuring skulls, measuring arm spans, height, different proportions of different criminals, and looking for patterns, looking for correlations. This is part of the biological explanation, as well as various research which points to specific genes or specific traits being passed down through parents. Generally speaking, the biological explanations are dismissed by most sociologists or played down to some extent. Psychological explanations, such as the Milgram experiment or the Stanford prison experiment, often come up in psychology qualifications. The Milgram experiment is where a person was asked to follow authority. A person in a lab coat would encourage them to provide electric shocks to what they didn't know to be an actor or actress behind a screen. They could hear that actor or actress screaming, thinking they were delivering more and more volts of electricity. This was inspired by the Nazis and trying to explain how the Nazis got people to carry out things like the Holocaust. So we can see over time, history, culture, and the individual needs of different societies to explain crime can have a massive influence on the methods they adopt and the way they look at crime. In the bottom right, we have pictures of various serial killers from Britain, America, Europe. These are often seen as folk devils, as deviants who are outside of the norm. They've experienced some sort of trauma or poor socialization, and often that is used to explain why they commit such horrible and usually repeat incidents and acts, such as murder, sexual violence, violence towards children. Merton and Becker, the functionalist and the interactionist ideas are key here. Is it the structure of society? Is that what leads to anomie? That's something that Merton and functionalists would argue as a real factor in explaining behaviour. Those at the bottom of society, they feel disconnected, they feel they can't achieve their goals. Think of the example of gangster rap, that those people involved in being ghettoized and being ostracized and labelled and valued poorly in society, they turn to drug dealing, to violence as a means to make money. Merton would say that's part of the structure of society. Becker would say that's to do with joining a deviant subculture. They're labelled the agents of formal social control, the police, the government, the criminal justice system. They deal with these people in ways which make them feel as if they have no other option. Remember, Becker says that all deviance is negotiated, and it entirely depends on who views it, what happens where and when. This is how the idea of peer groups and criminal subcultures really comes in. Are people socialized to be criminal, or is it the surroundings, the environment? This can then come into things like subcultures, gangs, status frustration, usually cited amongst young men. The idea that they're not recognized, they're not valued as young men, their identities are insecure, and this leads them into macho, masculine criminal behaviour. You may want to make links to Paul Willis's work of Learning to Labour for an education-based explanation which can follow on to the criminal-based explanations of Merton, and you compare that to Becker and how those two differentiate what is essentially a systemic, the way the country is organised, or an individual choice which forces people towards crime. Social class and crime. How sociologists view crime in terms of class obviously varies by perspective, and it will be explained in a way which can seem as if labelling is the most important element of this. Some sociologists, such as functionalists, will see it as how the structure of society really puts people in a position where they have no other choice. In the lower class case, it's enemy. The lower down you are, the less opportunity you have, the less access you have to resources, so crime seems a more viable alternative. This can link to Carlin's feminist ideas about women having less of an alternative, particularly working class women, because they make a gender and a class deal. But functions would see it in far more general terms. White collar crime is something which is seen specifically as a middle and upper class series of crimes. The jobs that those people do mean they have the opportunity, the resources, the access and the education to try and carry out these crimes and reward themselves through illegitimate financial means usually. That's why crimes such as fraud are easy examples of white collar crime. The social group that you belong to may be a deviant subculture within the class system. So the boys in the hoods, the young men, they may belong to a lower class or a working class background, and being part of that subculture, being labelled in certain ways, may then lead them to commit criminal acts. It may lead them to live up to certain stereotypes. It depends on, if you look at the interactionist view, that belonging to that subculture is a result of labelling, a result of the agents of social control such as schools, police, criminal justice system, having an act upon those individuals and that group, and then that influences their behaviour. Belonging to a deviant subculture such as punks may not be inherently criminal, but by dressing differently you may be more likely to become a victim of crime, particularly if you think about ideas around hate crime in this day and age, or it may lead you to indulge in certain criminal activities such as drug taking, alcohol, different activities which are part of the deviant subculture but are still criminal. Social class plays into that because the class you're in means you are more likely to be involved in certain subcultures or be involved in certain professions or certain jobs which can allow for white or blue collar crime. Functionalists would say this is a good thing. In small doses it allows the whole body, if you like, of society, if you take the organic model, to fix itself, to use a little bit of crime to reassess its values. And we may look at this in terms not just of class but in terms of gender, ethnicity and many other factors, all interlinking to see how important is class in certain cases. Therefore labelling as well as functionalism can work both ways in an essay in the exam and show that you understand both arguments, and you can see that class is one factor of many when it comes to crime. Gender and crime. Sociologists would regard gender in slightly different ways to other aspects of social stratification when it comes to crime. This will play nicely into research methods and probably be in the exam where you see research methods coming in, because men are so much more likely to have a criminal record, to commit violent crime, to be involved in crime than women, statistically speaking. Debates around the dark figure, around gender expectations, around many different ideas can come up in the exam, and you can use gender as a way to play against other ideas, again as we've talked about ethnicity, class, etc. So what we might look at is things like the chivalry thesis. Does the criminal justice system treat women more leniently than men? The PMS case and playing into biology may be a great example. But again, that was in the 1980s. Do we now see women as treated equally in terms of sentencing? Or do we still see an idea that sending women to prison denies children their mother, which has a massive impact on society? Do we see women treated more harshly if they commit certain crimes? A mother who, say, murders her child may be portrayed very differently in the media to a mother who has a child kidnapped, for example, or who has a partner who murders the child, or who has some involvement that perhaps isn't seen in quite the same way. So again, our values can directly link to our ideas of gender. if you take something like control theory and Carlin's ideas about working class women being forced to not only make a gender deal and live up to the expectations of housewife, of womanhood, of being in a very female role, there's also a class deal too, and working class aspirations. If they allow their husband to be the breadwinner, to go out and work, they'll be rewarded. Their housework, their love for their husband, that all plays nicely into a very functionalist ideal of the nuclear family. But as feminism argues, when that breaks down, if the breadwinner, if the male lets that woman down, she may be turned to crime. And there are certain crimes which are very gender specific. Prostitution could be an example of control theory of the class and gender deal allowing a woman to fall into crime because of some sort of breakdown. So gender can have a massive effect on the offence, the type of crime, who does it. Domestic violence is another example. The rise in domestic violence, with men as a victim and women as the perpetrator, is massively rising. But you may want to consider, is that due to social media? Is that due to campaigns? Is that due to some sort of stigma being changed within society, and what that tells us? Some of the criticisms of feminism are fairly obvious. Their gender is very critical towards men. Sorry, their gender-focused studies are very critical towards men. They are very apologetic towards women, you might argue, and you may see that as unfair or biased. And it doesn't explain why women have equal opportunity to commit crime, perhaps, or equal right to commit crime. So when you come to using gender in the exam and feminism, you may want to think very carefully about how you use words like patriarchy and male violence, male sexual violence, the cost and loss of reputation that crime brings to a woman. And think about, can you argue both sides? Can you bring in functionalist and Marxist ideas and link these together? Ethnicity in crime. Sociologists are left to explain massive differences in criminal behaviour between different ethnic groups, often based on official statistics. And one explanation is institutional racism. The idea that, particularly in the past, the police force was mostly working class to middle class white men, and the criminal justice system was middle to upper class white men, can explain why in the past, definitely, other ethnic minorities were disproportionately involved in prosecution, in prison, in being really focus of crime and criminal investigation. It's undeniable that black men and Asian men particularly are far more likely to have a criminal record, to have been stopped and searched by police in the past, to have been in prison or some form of criminal justice system correction. And we might want to look at that. If you think about the arguments about biology and Lombroso, these days, would we accept and would we allow someone to explain it in terms of genetics and racial lines? Undoubtedly no, that would be queried. Marxists might point to the fact that ethnic minorities tend to, particularly if they're first or second generation immigrants, tend to be in the lowest classes of society. If those lowest classes are exploited by society, that means they're more likely to be involved in crime, hence the difference in number, the difference in proportion. There may also be issues around not just need to commit crime and poverty, culture, understanding, language. There may be issues around that which could explain why ethnic minorities statistically commit more crime, as well as racism, as well as the social structure of family and friends that may not allow them to get away with crime, as it were, or be the focus of crime. You may see in the bottom corner a picture of police officers of all different races, and the idea of how representative the police force is in Britain is really key. If you go back historically to something like the Stephen Lawrence murder case, where a young black man was stabbed to death by white men, this was almost seen as a classic case of institutional racism. The police, the courts are seen and have admitted not doing enough to catch Stephen's killers and to letting them go free for so many years. So you may want to talk about stereotypes within the media, you may want to talk about stereotypes within the police force, you might want to talk about who actually does what, who's in the police force, who's in the community, what what could this tell us about social inequality? What could this tell us even about things like the job market and education? And link this back to previous modules. Therefore, that may help you explain ethnicity and crime. Age and crime. Age is probably of particular importance to yourselves because young people are seen as committing more crime, more likely to commit crime, and this can be for a variety of reasons. So criminal behaviour between different age groups, it stands to reason that older criminals may not be committing crimes which require, say, great physical feats, breaking and entering, for example. You may not see many pensioners or people of pensionable age breaking into buildings and stealing. Therefore, biologically speaking and physically speaking, that explains that. But what we see more often is this idea of status frustration. As you grow up, as you learn the rules of society, as you look to do things like edge work and push the boundaries, you may get involved in crime. Peer pressure and the role of social media perhaps and education can all explain why young people are more vulnerable, both as victims and offenders. Identity, the way you dress, class, gender, all of those things that we've discussed before may also factor into age and crime. You might want to look at status frustration when you're in the exam. You might want to think about realistically what are the types of crimes that young people commit. This can also come around from moral panics, from all the way back to Cohen's work on mods and rockers to drill music and the associations with drugs and violence and your reputation as a young person and how that can lead you into crime. Remember again, ways of dressing, ways of speaking, where you live, gangs, these things, they all come around in each era as different forms, different moral panics, but are essentially the same ideas. You may want to make comparisons there and then broaden that out in the exam to other factors. Again, class, gender, ethnicity, those key terms, hit those again and again. Informal social control is any form of behaviour modification or behaviour management by society which isn't written down, it isn't measured, it isn't a prison sentence, for example. This can come from your family, from your peer group, from people at school, in the workplace, from religion. And what this essentially means is when you do something deviant or something that people disapprove of, your behaviour is modified by their reaction. For example, the cartoon shows the role of religion in doing this and the threat of damnation and salvation, and people took their religion very seriously. Whereas today, the idea of being caught on CCTV, of people seeing you, can modify your behaviour. Think about how you may behave in front of your boss when you're at work compared to your colleagues. Think about how you may behave if someone like myself, a teacher or a senior member of staff at school, could see your behaviour, or if they don't. Think about the idea of young children that copy the behaviour and how they might act in front of their parents, how you may act in front of your parents both now and in the past. And again, the idea of signs around that show what society expects of you can inform how we control our behaviour. This might be disapproval, this might even be a dirty look from somebody, this might be verbal correction of your behaviour, letting you know the expectations. This could be all sorts of different things. Informal social control is often in the moment and very much related to what has happened there and then and who has done what. Formal social control. When trying to explain formal social control, think of it in terms of the opposite of informal. There is a recognised governing body or person, or what we call an agency of formal social control, which deals with specific sets of behaviour. Certain rules, specifically the law, have been broken, and there are guidelines in how they can treat people who break those laws and break those norms. So the police, the court system, the Home Office is the government department that are responsible for dealing with crime in Britain. The Ministry of Justice and the Serious Fraud Office are a specific branch of the government which deals obviously with fraud on a high level, so usually white collar crime and corporate crime. You can see obviously the Houses of Parliament where government sits. That's the highest authority in the land, that's where formal social control is derived from. We also have the Queen as the monarch, so you may want to think about how our laws are put into action and what role actually the Houses of Parliament have, the Houses of Lords have. And you can see there is a flow chart which shows the different types of court. So criminal law and civil law are slightly different. Criminal law is for any offence against the law of the land, against the state. Civil law might be against a person. So if you were suing someone for slander, for defamation, if it was you against them, that would be civil law, and you'd be looking to go through specific sets of courts, usually for compensation. Criminal law is where a crime could result in a prison sentence, for example. So they've broken a law which would be an indictable offence. They go to court, and then it's decided whether they go to prison or any of the other punishments, ASBOs, tags, those kind of things. These are forms of social control, and these are all derived by the criminal justice system, and often they will lead to the prison system. So that is where you want to think about what it is society can do to a criminal, why they can do that, how they can do that, and what that means for us in terms of norms and values. The treatment of young offenders. How society responds to criminal behaviour by young people is very controversial. In Britain, from the age of 10, you are criminally responsible. And you may want to think about something like the James Bolger murder, where John Venables and Robert Thompson were both primary school age when they murdered the toddler. That was a shocking act. That was a huge news story at the time, and still affects how law operates today and how many people see young offenders. This isn't something that's new. It massively predates Venables and Thompson. It was in the Victorian era where children were separated from adults in the prison system. Before then, everyone was just locked up together. And obviously the amount of abuse that opened up was seen as something that needed to be rectified. Nowadays, you wouldn't lock up children alongside adult inmates. You may want to think about the example of Spain we looked at, where young offenders institutes are about education and reformation. This can be very different to the British system, where it's more like prison. It's more like an adult prison, and offenders are locked away, and they are educated, and they are given rights and responsibilities, but it mimics more of the adult system and is closer to that. Lastly, you may want to look at not only these debates around punishment and education, but moral panics and the labelling of young people. Albert Cohen looked at delinquency, which is an old-fashioned word for youth crime, or criminals who are young, and their subcultures. So the mods and the rockers were the subcultures that were violent and rivals, if you like, in Cohen's time. Obviously, you may see that in modern-day gangs. You may see that in things like postcode wars and what's now spread through YouTube and other social media avenues. And this essentially is a huge debate about, are families doing enough? Are schools doing enough? How are we seeing young people socialise in society, and why does that lead some to crime? So essentially there's a debate about class, gender and ethnicity, again coming through the prism of age this time. And what are parents doing? What are other agents of social control doing, formal and informal? So when you look at the treatment of young offenders, you may want to look at not only just the age of criminal responsibility, but is it right to put them in certain types of facilities? Should there be more of an emphasis on education? Is it right to execute anyone, particularly the young? Those are debates that may well come up, or you may want to explore. The prison system. Much of the debate in your exam about the prison system will be, what is it designed to achieve? Is it designed to punish the individual? Is it designed to reform them? And what alternatives do we have to prison? The death penalty is one debate which often crops up when it comes to sentencing, particularly for serious crimes. Now, in Britain, we haven't had the death penalty officially since 1969, but our last execution was 1964. So it's within a lifetime, but it is a long time ago. Prison now, often there are media debates around prison and prisons being soft and criminals sort of having an easy life in prison, or prisons being poorly run and inhumane and not well equipped to deal with actually the basic human needs of every prisoner. And people will debate this, and there's ways to look at this in terms of class particularly, and what that means to society and how we treat our prisoners. Now, you may see the cartoon where people are going through a revolving door in and out of prison. The word for that is recidivism, and the idea of reoffending, how often do people reoffend? Now, the British system has a reasonably high rate of reoffending. If we compare that to Norway, where the Norwegian prison is much more open and light, and people almost live in flats, in these small little clusters where they can socialise and they can live in a much more pleasant surroundings rather than being locked in a cell for hours at a time. This is credited as to why Norway has such a low rate of reoffending. The debate is quite complicated, and again, the societies aren't directly comparable. The amount of people, the amount of criminals in both societies vary massively. In Britain, we also have other systems, tags, ASBOs, community service, that are alternatives to prison, as well as the fact that prison sentences can be reduced for good behaviour, and often people will serve half a sentence in prison and then go out on tag or on licence. This is where the probation system comes in and reintegrating people into society. The more successful they are at doing that, obviously the idea being is the less reoffending there is. This can be seen as protecting people. Are we protecting both the offender and society by locking them up for a certain amount of time, by reintegrating them slowly into society? And you might want to compare that with, say, the idea of the panopticon. So the panopticon is a very old idea, and you can see a real life panopticon in Cuba, which was a communist country, on the slide there. So these were actually put into practice, and the panopticon has the tower in the middle where guards can be at any place at any time and view any prisoner. So the prisoner is constantly on display, a bit like an animal in a cage in a zoo, and that's very controversial. But it shows very clearly how some societies want to treat prisoners and want to make the prisoner feel and live out their sentences, or live out their life within prison. So you may want to think about the reality versus the media narrative and versus, say, the TV and film narrative about prisons. What does that show us about society's values would be a key functionalist argument. Violent crime and sentencing. How society responds to violent crime can tell you a lot, and usually how they respond in relation to sentencing and what punishments they give for violent offenders is a matter of great debate. Again, we've looked at things like the Ruth Ellis case, and is it right to hang a woman? Is it right to hang anybody? Was the overriding sentiment at the time in 1955. So the death penalty is something which comes back time and again, and the influence of, say, religion on the death penalty is something which you may want to talk about, and secularization. But there is still popular demand for the death penalty. It's very much a minority view in Britain, according to statistics and according to various polls, but there are people who support it. Countries which still have it would talk about deterrence, but obviously if people are still being executed, people are still committing crimes and are not put off by the risk of the death penalty, as it were. Similarly with prison. Now, violent offences, things like domestic violence have certain stigmas around them, and then things like gang-related violence can also be seen very differently. So again, it's taking those factors of age, gender, class, ethnicity, and playing with those in your essays, putting those into your exam and seeing how those debates come out. Mandatory prison sentence in this country is 25 years, and when people talk about life sentences, when they talk about the need to put people away for life, and life meaning life, that's a debate that you can have around the aims of prison, around the aims of punishment and what that means. So again, we're talking about really the prison system in relation to violent crime. Perhaps the dark figure you may want to talk about, and how often a violent crime is detected and punished, and what the criminal justice system does and how it's viewed and how it views these offenders. Media reporting of crime. Essentially, this is about how accurate is the reporting of crime by the media. So keywords such as sensationalism, deviancy amplification, moral panics, and the violence which focuses the media content are all areas you want to talk about. So there's something called the amplification spiral, where an event is reported, people react to that when they read it, people copy it, there's a bigger reaction, this increases in deviance, and it goes round in a loop. So deviance amplification might come from copycat crimes, people seeing behaviour and wanting to be part of that or be in some way involved. Sensationalism is the language around how people are talked about and the way they're talked about in terms of their race, their gender, their age, and what that does to society. A moral panic could be any small group or type of crime which is overplayed or exaggerated by the media. So you may see things like the modern rockers that Cohen has talked about. You may see things like youth gangs or terrorism of some sort, and this along racial lines or religious lines, or something which is a threat to society in the way it's portrayed and perceived. And that threat actually may be a lot smaller in reality. So the media role is really one of how accurately do they report this. And often, we talked about the James Bulger case before. In the 80s and 90s, violent horror films, what were known as video nasties, were blamed and seen as a massive influence on these killings and other killings since. Rock music and alternative music, certain acts, certain artists have been blamed and labelled and stigmatised because of their media content being disapproved of, perhaps, and the media using them as someone to blame for different offences. So the media's role really can be quite a negative one in this debate, but it can be positive too. You can see how criminals can be caught through the media, through raising awareness, through appeals, that kind of thing as well. And someone like Marxists may argue that actually the reporting is very biased. Lower class criminals are reported on, and lower class people are talked about in ways which put the focus on them far more than, say, white collar crime. How often is corporate crime, a company not paying its taxes or committing some sort of environmental crime, front page news, compared to someone who could be stigmatized and demonized much easier perhaps. So you may want to bring these debates in, you may want to talk about that. Functionalists may talk about it in terms of value consensus. What's most important gets the most news coverage. Therefore, actually, the media's role isn't a negative one. It is simply doing a job which society needs and society values. Feminists may talk about the language around male offenders and female offenders, and that may be a criticism too. If you think about someone like a teacher who abuses their position, if they commit some sort of sexual offence with their students, a male teacher versus a female teacher may be reported on in very different ways. And we can use this sort of content analysis to look at values and look at value consensus and talk about the role of the media. Functionalist theories about crime. There are two functionalist studies you need to know for the exam. Cohen's study on delinquent boys and Merton's studies, social theory and social structure. So if we start with Cohen, he's writing in 1963. And he's looking at working class boys, and we may want to draw a parallel between the Marxist Paul Willis here. I would stick really, though, when we're talking about crime, away from too greater emphasis on Willis because it's a different part of the exam. You mention it in passing, but they're both looking at working class boys. They're both talking about how working class boys might have the same success goals from the rest of society, but cannot achieve them. They would look at those in very different ways. Now, when we're looking at crime, the consequence of educational failure means these young men are more likely to commit crime because they can't achieve their goals in any other way. So this plays into Merton's ideas of anomie, which we'll come to. So Cohen looks at cultural deprivation, access to improving themselves socially and meritocracy, status frustration, a deviant subculture offering them an easier route or a more comfortable route than that of struggling to better themselves. Therefore, they end up committing crime and being involved in crime. Plus, the prestige given by their peers is immediate, and this gratification, this idea of having a rep, if you like, or being seen to be more masculine, can appeal to working class boys. You may want to ask yourself, is that still relevant? Do you recognise that in yourself today? Do you see that around yourself in the media, in the news, within school, within your own life? Merton talked about anomie and that being the main cause of deviance, the structure of society not allowing everyone to be able to succeed through legitimate means, through education, through being socialised properly. Therefore, they use the social structure to commit crime, as it were, and this allows them to achieve meritocracy, if you like, in a different way. So there are 5 ways that anomie can happen. people try and conform and they can't do it. So they turn to some kind of deviant or criminal behaviour. They maybe innovate things, and this can lead to breaking the rules. This can then lead them to commit certain crimes or certain deviant behaviour. Ritualism, so the idea of religion and secularisation and living in a way that's expected of them, can allow them to break certain rules and come up with new ways of succeeding. Retreatism, they may just totally be an outsider, a deviant that lives in, say, the kibbutz from the family module, a hippie commune. They may live in a completely unorthodox and unnormal way, for want of a better word, and that leads them to be deviant. Not always criminal. And rebellion, fairly self-explanatory, they rebel against society. So Durkheim would be the earliest functionalist, and Durkheim did a massive study of crime where he looked at crime rates across different countries and compared them. So very much a macro picture, a big picture. Lots of statistics, lots of number crunching, lots of patterns and correlations. And this quote from Durkheim, that man is a moral being only because he lives in society. Let all social life disappear and morality will disappear with it, kind of points to the idea that we form our societies, we structure our societies, and within that we structure what's allowed and what's not. And that explains why crime can happen. So functionalists would talk in terms of boundaries and values within a society. They talk about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of social cohesion. Think of the organic model there, the model of the body and the different organs. Deviant behaviour is a safety valve. We can check deviant behaviour, we can check criminal behaviour and assess our own values. Strain theory, the idea of living up to society's expectations and other people's expectations, can put a strain upon us. And this can lead us to join different subcultures, and the subcultures we join could be deviant or they could be criminal. Therefore, functionalism is very much big picture, very much structure of society, and you want to remember that when you're talking about either Cohen's focus on young working class boys or Merton's focus much more broadly on society and much more broadly on deviance than criminal behaviour. Marxism and crime. Marxists are conflict theorists, and obviously their main focus is class. Now, there isn't a specific study that relates to Marxism within your exam. So if you're talking about any essay question, functionalist ideas, Merton, Cohen, very good idea to contrast their ideas in an essay with Marxists. Remember, you hit kind of 6 marks automatically if you can give a contrasting view very well. So Marxists would talk about white-collar crime. They'd talk about blue-collar crime, if you like, or working-class crime, and the unfairness both in focused by the police, focused by the media, focused by the criminal justice system in terms of sentencing, punishment. So you may want to look at the cartoons and ask yourself, does this reflect the reality in society? Does the man robbing the bank versus the chief exec taking his bonus, is there any difference between those people taking money out of the bank? Marxists would say the only difference is how they're perceived as a crime and how society treats both of those people. So the Marxist view is very much focused on status, on social inequality, on poverty, and you can make further links to gender through feminism, you can make further links to ethnicity, as we talked about. But really what you want to be talking about is Marxism is totally disagreeing with functionalists. The structure of society does lead to crime, perhaps, but it leads to crime because the working class, the proletariat, are exploited by the bourgeoisie, by the ruling class. Interactionists. Interactionists and their theories of crime really revolves around Outsiders by Howard Becker. This is a study which is a really useful one to know. In your exam, you may want to use Becker to contrast any of the other theories. Because Becker is an interactionist, he's very different in his approach. We're talking small scale, individual, small groups, outward, rather than the big picture sociologists, the macro sociologists, such as functionalists and Marxists and feminists. So labelling is a huge part of Becker's ideas. The way we label people can lead to criminal behaviour, and this can go all the way back through family, through education, through social stratification, other modules that we've looked at. But the idea of labelling leads to self-fulfilling prophecy, leads to master status, and this is all stuck upon people by individuals, by other people, and the agents of social control can do that. If someone is arrested, they may well be found innocent, but they are labelled a criminal by their peers, by society. The idea of no smoke without fire, or mud sticking, for example. This can lead people down deviant careers. This can lead people to deviant subcultures. So Becker really talks about the idea that crime is negotiated. It's all about who commits the deviant act, where do they commit it, who sees it, how is it interpreted. Because, for example, if you think about, if you do something deviant in the privacy of your own home, there's no real consequence for that. If you do it out in the street or out in public, there could be a massive consequence. It might be an informal consequence, such as disapproval, or it may get you arrested. So an example might be nudity. You could walk around nude in your own home, but if you go and do that in the street, it's very likely you'll be looked at funny, it's very likely you'll be arrested, and it's very likely you may face some kind of criminal sanction. So anything along those lines in your exam, you may want to talk about interpretation and how labels are negotiated, and this can lead to criminal behaviour eventually. So it plays very nicely into ideas of socialisation and identity. Feminist theories about crime. Again, feminists are conflict sociologists, so they're closer perhaps to Marxists. Obviously their focus is gender rather than class. There are two studies by feminists that really you need to know in great detail. Pat Carlin's study in 1998 about control theory, women, crime and poverty, and Hayden's own theory from much earlier, her study from 1985 about women and crime, and again that relates to control theory too. So Carlin used in-depth unstructured interviews, so you may want to think about the method there, how it's high in validity, but one of the criticisms of Carlin is that it's a small sample size. She looked at working class women, so hers is very class-based as well as gender-based, which plays nicely against Marxist views, if you like, and as a contrast to functionalist views. All the women she looked at were fairly young. All the women she looked at had been convicted of at least one crime. And she talked about the idea that, much like Becker actually, no one is born a criminal, it's a choice. You weigh up the advantages and disadvantages, and women tend to make a deal with men. So this was mentioned earlier, but women perhaps play the role of housewife in exchange for their domestic labour, in exchange for their love, in exchange for their family role. The man provides, he is the breadwinner. And if they live up to certain class and certain gender stereotypes, they live a happy nuclear family, and this would be something that functionalists would agree with and functionalists would argue. But Carlin says that's hugely problematic when that relationship fails. If the breadwinner fails, the woman somehow fails the family, a woman may be forced to turn to crime, and that's as part of a survival mechanism. And the criminal justice system may not recognise that, so they may not have a chivalry thesis in action. There may actually be a case of women are punished according to the law, but they found themselves in that situation because they went along with society's expectations about being female, about being a good housewife, and men have let them down. Heidenstein talks about the fact that women commit fewer crimes than men. Male-dominated patriarchal societies control women. Therefore, women can't really break the law. If you think about bedroom culture and how women are socialised from a young age, boys will be boys, boys are encouraged to play rough, boys are encouraged to be boisterous, the very word, whereas women are sort of to be looked at, seen and not heard, wear the pretty dress, play with certain toys that limit behaviour, if you were, or limit aggression. And Heidenstein used this idea to really show that because men dominate society, they're going to dominate crime, they're going to dominate the criminal justice system on both sides of it. There's a tweet here which I found really interesting. The only statistical legitimate generalisation to be made about violent crime is that every single society, it's men who commit the overwhelming majority of it. When women commit a violent crime, it's often seen as a crime of passion. A woman who kills her unfaithful husband, how that's dealt with in the media, how the narrative of that is very different to if a man commits domestic violence or kills his wife. You may want to talk about that in terms of media, in terms of social expectations, but also in terms of the reality. You know, what do those crimes show us? So compare feminism to any of the other outlooks that we've looked at, to any of the other studies, and you'll see this idea of focusing on gender perhaps may limit it and may be a criticism, but it allows us to explore other themes about class, about identity, about who's committing what types of crime and why. So when you come to your exam, I would always, if you can, use feminism as a great contrast to functionalism and as a great contrast to Marxism, because they are not the same. And obviously Becker's studies from an interactionist point of view could be a bridge between the two. That concludes everything that you would need to know for crime and deviance on the exam paper. Obviously, it's not possible for every single thing to come up, but that doesn't mean that you can just guess or pick and choose. I hope now you've made some notes, that you found this very useful. You may want to revisit this and go through it in a different way. Perhaps if you did a spider diagram, you may want to just take notes. Perhaps you may want to try one of the alternatives to taking notes and going back over what you've done so far. If there's anything that was unclear, please send me a question. Please email me a question. Please leave it on our Google Classroom or in the comments below, and I will try and get back to you either individually or as a group so that you can get the answers to that. Good luck, and again, thank you very much for using this resource.